been committed, an expiatory sacrifice should be offered by the pontiffs in the grove of Diana. For you know that the crime of incest is commonly supposed to cause a dearth. Hence it would be meet that atonement for the offence should be made to the goddess of fertility. Now on the principle that the goddess of fertility must herself be fertile, it behooved Diana to have a male partner. Her mate, if the testimony of Servius may be trusted, was that Virbius who had his representative, or perhaps rather his embodiment, in the king of the wood at Nemi. The aim of their union would be to promote the fruitfulness of the earth, of animals, and of mankind, and it might naturally be thought that this object would be more surely attained if the sacred nuptials were celebrated every year, the parts of the divine bride and bridegroom being played either by their images or by living persons. No ancient writer mentions that this was done in the grove at Nemi, but our knowledge of the Arician ritual is so scanty that the want of information on this head can hardly count as a fatal objection to the theory. That theory, in the absence of direct evidence, must necessarily be based on the analogy of similar customs practised elsewhere. Some modern examples of such customs, more or less degenerate, were described in the last chapter. Here we shall consider their ancient counterparts. 2. The marriage of the gods. At Babylon, the imposing sanctuary of Baal rose like a pyramid above the city in a series of 8 towers or stories, planted one on the top of the other. On the highest tower, reached by an ascent which wound about all the rest, there stood a spacious temple, and in the temple a great bed, magnificently draped and cushioned, with a golden table beside it. In that temple no image was to be seen, and no human being passed the night there, save a single woman, whom, according to the Chaldean priests, the god chose from among all the women of Babylon. They said that the deity himself came into the temple at night and slept in the great bed, and the woman, as a consort of the god, might have no intercourse with mortal men. At Thebes in Egypt, a woman slept in the temple of Ammon as the consort of the god, and, like the human wife of Baal at Babylon, she was said to have no commerce with a man. In Egyptian texts she is often mentioned as the divine consort, and usually she was no less a personage than the queen of Egypt herself. For according to the Egyptians, their monarch was actually begotten by the god Ammon, who assumed for the time being the form of the reigning king, and in that disguise had intercourse with the queen. The divine procreation is carved and painted in great detail on the walls of 2 of the oldest temples in Egypt, those of Deir al-Bahari and Luxor, and the inscriptions attached to the paintings leave no doubt as to the meaning of the scenes. At Athens, the god of the vine, Dionysus, was annually married to the queen, and it appears that the consummation of the divine union, as well as their espousals, was enacted at the ceremony, but whether the part of the god was played by a man or an image we do not know. We learn from Aristotle that the ceremony took place in an old official residence of the king, known as the cattle stall, which stood near the Prytaneum or town hall on the northeastern slope of the Acropolis. The object of the marriage can hardly have been any other than that of ensuring the fertility of the vines and other tree fruits of which Dionysus was the king. Thus both in form and meaning, the ceremony would answer to the nuptials of the king and queen of May. In the great mysteries solemnized at Eleusis in the month of September, the union of the sky god Zeus with the corn goddess Demeter appears to have been represented by the union of the Hierophant with the priestess of Demeter, who acted the parts of god and goddess. But their intercourse was only dramatic or symbolical, for the Hierophant had temporarily deprived himself of his virility by an application of hemlock. The torches having been extinguished, the pair descended into a murky place, while the throng of worshippers awaited in anxious suspense the result of the mystic congress, on which they believed their own salvation to depend. After a time the Hierophant reappeared, and in a blaze of light silently exhibited to the assembly a reaped ear of corn, the fruit of the divine marriage. Then in a loud voice he proclaimed, "Queen Brimo has brought forth the sacred boy Brimos," by which he meant, "The mighty one has brought forth the mighty." The corn mother, in fact, had given birth to her child the corn, and her travail pangs were enacted in the sacred drama. This revelation of the reaped corn appears to have been the crowning act of the mysteries, Thus, through the glamour shed round these rites by the poetry and philosophy of later ages, there still looms, like a distant landscape through a sunlight haze, a simple rustic festival designed to cover the wild Eleusinian plain with a plenteous harvest by wedding the goddess of the corn to the sky god, who fertilized the bare earth with genial showers. Every few years the people of Plataea in Boeotia held a festival called the Little Diadala, at which they felled an oak tree in an ancient oak forest. Out of the tree they carved an image, and having dressed it as a bride, they set it on a bullock cart with the bridesmaid beside it. The image seems then to have been drawn to the bank of the river Asopus and back to the town, attended by a piping and dancing crowd. Every 60 years the festival of the Great Daedala was celebrated by all the people of Boeotia, and at it all the images, 14 in number, which had accumulated at the lesser festivals, were dragged on wains in procession to the river Asopus, and then to the top of Mount Kithairon, where they were burnt on a great pyre. The story told to explain the festivals suggests that they celebrated the marriage of Zeus to Hera, represented by the oaken image in bridal array. In Sweden, every year a life-size image of Frey, the god of fertility, both animal and vegetable, was drawn about the country in a wagon attended by a beautiful girl who was called the god's wife. She acted also as his priestess in his great temple at Uppsala. Wherever the wagon came with the image of the god and his blooming young bride, people crowded to meet them and offered sacrifices for a fruitful year. Thus the custom of marrying gods either to images or to human beings was widespread among the nations of antiquity. The ideas on which such a custom is based are too crude to allow us to doubt that the civilized Babylonians, Egyptians, and Greeks inherited it from their barbarous or savage forefathers. This presumption is strengthened when we find rites of similar kind in vogue among the lower races. Thus, for example, we are told that once upon a time the Wotyaks of the Malmys district in Russia were distressed by a series of bad harvests. They did not know what to do, but at last concluded that the powerful but mischievous god Kemiret must be angry at being unmarried. So a deputation of elders visited the Wotyaks of Kura, and came to an understanding with them on the subject. Then they returned home, laid in a large stock of brandy, and having made ready a gaily decked wagon and horses, they drove in procession with bells ringing, as they do when they are fetching home a bride, to the sacred grove at Kura. There they ate and drank merrily all night, and next morning they cut a square piece of turf in the grove and took it home with them. After that, though it fared well with the people of Malmys, it fared ill with the people of Kura, for in Malmys the bread was good, but in Kura it was bad. Hence the men of Kura who had consented to the marriage were blamed and roughly handled by their indignant fellow villagers. What they means by this marriage ceremony, says the writer who reports it, is not easy to imagine. Perhaps, as Bechterew thinks, they meant to marry Kemeret to the kindly and fruitful Mukulchin, the earth wife, in order that she may influence him for good. When wells are dug in Bengal, a wooden image of a god is made and married to the goddess of water. Often the bride destined for the god is not a log or a clod, but a living woman of flesh and blood. The Indians of a village in Peru have been known to marry a beautiful girl, about 14 years of age, to a stone shaped like human being, which they regarded as a god, Huaca. All the villagers took part in the marriage ceremony, which lasted 3 days, and was attended with much revelry. The girl thereafter remained a virgin and sacrificed to the idol for the people. They showed her the utmost reverence and deemed her divine. Every year about the middle of March, when the season for fishing with the dragnet began, the Algonquins and Hurons married their nets to 2 young girls, aged 6 or 7. At the wedding feast the net was placed between the 2 maidens, and was exhorted to take courage and catch many fish. The reason for choosing the brides so young was to make sure that they were virgins. The origin of the custom is said to have been this. One year, when the fishing season came round, the Algonquins cast their nets as usual, but took nothing. Surprised at their want of success, they did not know what to make of it, till the soul or genius, Oki, of the net appeared to them in the likeness of a tall well-built man, who said to them in great passion, "I have lost my wife, and I cannot find one